I mean, as you know, I'm Katja Stille, chair of the Urban Design Group. As always, the session tonight will be recorded, and the normal kind of approach it applies in terms of keep yourself on mute, post your questions into the chat, and then we will pick out the questions and kind of ask you to contribute. I mean, not just questions, but also comments. I mean, we want to keep it really informal and really as a workshop and discussion. Before we start, I want to kind of set the scene a little bit, and let me just find. So at the moment, we are going to talk about the National Model Design Code. But that only is one document that influences our urban environment. And we know there are lots of other different codes and regulations and technical standards and contracts that all influence the end product of our urban environment. And I think it's worth just reflecting on those, or kind of reminding ourselves of those, or some of those, because I mean, the National Model Design Code in itself isn't the only document that will influence our designs and the quality of our places. And in some areas, often these documents conflict with one another. So I think it's something to keep in mind in the discussion, really. I mean, we have, for example, I mean, we also had lots of different codes throughout history, and Robert will talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But we also have waste management, we have construction products, we have street design, and we have marine and transport regulations. So all of these kind of impact on the design. It's not just the planning and the design guidance and the design codes. I mean, we all know that streets are designed for waste collection vehicles, but not only those, it's actually generally streets are designed for vehicles. And often the vehicles are again influenced by the codes for the size of containers, etc., etc. So there are a lot of elements which are actually out of our scope of influence that influence the end product. It's not a product, it's a place, the places we design in the end of the day. And I mean, we've all come across, beautiful designs for streets, and then the kind of tracking and the HGV's tracking goes over it. And, unfortunately, nothing from all the design intentions is kind of left over afterwards. I mean, the waste collection in itself, it's actually controlled by the size of the bins and the operational requirements that often are enshrined in contracts. So councils sometimes don't have a choice. I mean, they have a choice in terms of signing up to contracts, but then as this quote says, there's a lot of money involved as well. So we need to make sure that all the good intentions that are set out also in the design codes and design guides will actually be deliverable. We all know that street design, waste collection can often conflict with the intentions with Manual for Streets, with public sector equality laws, and statements set out in the NPPF as well. I mean, often our streets are more designed around the operational requirements of waste collection than actual people. Sorry. But then we also have places like this, and also people living in these streets have their waste collected. So it does work. It just kind of works differently. So we just need to kind of think differently and maybe not have a kind of one-fits-all approach to those contracts and those operational requirements. In this picture, I mean, I've only highlighted a few, but actually there might be a design code that sets out the space and the building and the location of the building. But I've come across developers and construction companies that have health and safety policies that dictate the slope of a roof in terms of construction and the health and safety of the people building those buildings. We have permitted developments that allow the close-boarded fences. We have technical guidance that influence the design of the head walls. So it's not just the design guides and the design code, it's a lot of other elements which often, as designers, we are not in control of. In this picture, I could imagine that maybe the designers, they've moved that one building back a little bit. Maybe they wanted to create a widening in the road or a kind of space, which kind of changes the street scene. But in the end of the day, when it was constructed, it had probably had more to do with the various kind of limitations and technical standards that are set out on the right. So saying a lot of things in design guidance and design codes and in policy is one thing, delivering is another thing. And I mean, this is a diagram which tries to make sense of all these different elements. And I mean, we have legislation, we have acts of parliament, common law duties, and then we have that element of strategic planning, strategic design, where the kind of the design community comes in. There we have national government policies, local authority policies, and then we have the master planning. And possibly the master planning and the design code sits kind of between in the master planning and the detailed design stages. But then as we come to delivering them, we have technical guidance, construction standards, British standards, etc. And then at the end, we have CDM regulation, contracts, everything that influences the design. So it's a kind of loop, and we need to understand all of the different aspects in order to deliver on our vision. So when we write national government policies, we need to know the impact at the end and the operational requirements and the contracts. And I mean, one of the examples that generally is quoted is, for example, the trees. And we all know the problems with trees. So I think this is just something to keep in mind while we are actually talking about the National Design Guide and the Design Code and all the guidance that comes afterwards. It's just to kind of keep in mind that there isn't really, I think, a single solution, and we need to make sure that all the different elements are tied together. But that's enough for me to set the scene. So now over to Robert Huxford. Robert?
Right, just getting the share started. And so here we go. Well, I'm going to, about 25 years ago or so, I was skulking around in an archive and reading papers on, well, street design. And I discovered something on the aesthetic side of things. And somebody was saying in this paper that streets designed to the model bylaws, the uniformity of the streets designed to the model bylaws may appeal to the eye of some, but to the eye of the artist, give rise to feelings of nausea. So, well, this got me fairly interested. What were these model bylaws? And I tried year after year to find them. I actually found a copy online last year. So I'm going to share with you, with your permission. In fact, you don't have to give me your permission. I'm going to do it anyway. What they contain, and that bar is the English House Condition Survey. They give an indication of the when houses were built, what proportion, and the proportion that were built in response to the model bylaws and the Victorian bylaws. It's about a third of the stock. It's very, very significant. And it seems to be a part of our history that we've forgotten. And I hope I convince you that there's a lot to learn. What I'm going to do is just present what I found, and I'm hoping you're going to make insightful and intelligent conclusions that will help me. I'm just trying to move, right, here we go, off we go. So yes, so please apply your insight, and I hope we'll be able to draw conclusions to the what impact these bylaws, the bylaw approach had, and the disadvantages, the advantages, the pitfalls, and whether it provides lessons for us today. Anyway, so the oldest codes, we've got the medieval era, and there were standard plot sizes. Things are measured in rods, roughly 5 meters. And the main thing was that people had a large enough bit of land to live on. We get standard widths. There's some control on building materials. In medieval towns, fire was never a present problem. So thatch was, in some towns and cities, frowned upon. Air quality. In London, there was constraints on burning sea coal, but it seemed to be a fairly light touch, apart from if you step out of line, you get executed by some lord or king. But apart from that sort of thing, the codes were more or less a framework. And if you get a chance to out of lockdown, go to a place like Winchelsea, a medieval town that's been laid out and then mostly abandoned, and you can still see the format of the plots. This diagram produced by Sue McGlynn and Ida Samuels about the distinctiveness. In traditional towns, there's a very limited materials and elements palette. Materials are limited by the fact that they cost a lot of money to import in, so you're going to use stuff that's local. The elements, well, it's local craftspeople, local architects, local styles that get picked up, but the variety increases as one goes from overall form to plots to streets to the old districts. Whereas today, with transport costs being negligible, you can get building materials brought in from China. In a new development, one has the entire planet at one's disposal in terms of obtaining materials. Design elements are imported from all over the world. The exchange of information on fashion is tremendous, but it leads to this uniformity. Anyway, so let's move on. Old codes, the Rebuilding of London Act after the Great Fire. Whoops. The first and least sorts of houses, it implies 3 or 4 sorts of lane: by lanes, streets and lanes of notes, high and principal streets, and then there's the a 4th and largest type of house for citizens and persons of extraordinary quality. And I'm sure everybody tonight ought to be classified as a person of extraordinary quality. It's calling for all of the roofs of the first 3 sorts of houses to be uniform. Well, let's move straight into the 19th century now. And the imperatives were health, hygiene, light, and ventilation. This graph compares life expectancy in the 1840s with life expectancy now. And you can see in some of the expanding industrial towns, life expectancy was terrible. So under age 20, if you were an infant, life expectancy of birth of an infant born into a labouring family, you will be lucky to get beyond the age of 20. One can see what it does to population pyramids. There are epidemic disease, waterborne diseases, cholera and typhoid, diseases associated with overcrowding, such as tuberculosis and typhus. Keats, 200th anniversary of death earlier this week, died of tuberculosis. It apparently carried off about 25% of the population. It's quite appalling, quite tragic. And you can see how the population pyramid has changed, and most of us have a reasonable expectation of getting into retirement, whereas in the early part of the 19th century, you didn't. Overcrowding. There was the Health of Towns Association, 1844. Cooped up, filthy in habits, debased in morals, oppressed with want, abandoned and reckless. They described the conditions in a Petticoat Lane, Whitechapel. Construction was poor. Sanitation was appalling. Contamination of water supplies led to this circulation of waterborne disease. We know air quality was dire as well. And you have this problem of rickets, caused in part by the loss of sunlight that brings vitamin D, but also poor diet too. And we're getting these problems once again in the 21st century. The conditions look so much worse than when they're in black and white, but if they're in a color photograph, it doesn't somehow look so bad. There is what would have been in its time described as a slum. It's now a museum and a grade 2 listed building in Birmingham. That's something else that we can go and visit when we're liberated later in the year. Anyway, there was a key report, the report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain, 1842, by this chap called Edwin Chadwick, a hugely important figure, absolutely fundamentally important in changing the way we built towns and cities and buildings and streets. So a series of legislation followed. There's the 1847 Town Improvement Act, and here are some of the contents. So there's a requirement. Part of this is about the reform of local government, the bolstering of its powers and competence. Local government is required to appoint a surveyor, an inspector of nuisances, create maps, to create sewers, to prevent new houses being built without being connected to drains. So that's about the level at which the house is built. It mustn't be built below the level of drains. In this period, no electric pumps, so everything, all drainage is down to gravity. You can't build a building without first giving a notice to the commissioners. There's requirements on the width of new streets. Carriage roads must be at least 30 foot wide. Building lines, doors in future to be made to open inwards. Stuff about ruinous buildings, requirements to clean streets, cleanse them, sweep footways, party walls carried up through roofs, and powers to set rates so that there is a system of finance here. And it's resisted. It took decades for this public health movement to really have an effect on the way we build towns and cities. And this article from the Times, we prefer to take our chance with cholera than be bullied into health. There is nothing a man hates so much as being cleansed against his will or having his floor swept, his hall whitewashed, his dung heaps cleared away, and his thatch forced to give way to slate. The slate, this is about fire protection. And in this, you'll recognize things that are being circulated today. People are objecting to being compelled to do things in relation to the coronavirus epidemic, about changing lifestyles, about being asked to abandon their cars and have a more active lifestyle. The nanny state, it goes on and on. There are parallels. We repeat history. So we come onto the model bylaws now. This follows from the Great Public Health Act of 1875. Model bylaws 1877 enforced by the Local Government Management Board. These are the chapters. It talks about the cleansing, the removal of house refuse, the abatement of nuisances, dealing with common lodging houses, which is very much about the overcrowding side of things again, the construction of new streets and buildings, which is where we're going to be interested, and slaughterhouses, where we're probably not going to be interested in. So it covers a load of stipulations, a minimum width of streets, 36 foot. Subsequently, London requires 40 foot. There's a variation of requirements according to the length of streets. So a street exceeding 60 foot in length has to be open at both ends. It's the notion is that ventilation is a lack of ventilation is a cause of disease, and the problem they have is they don't have microbiology at that stage. They don't understand fully how disease spreads. Epidemiology is a science that doesn't really get going until the 1850s. And just as much as there are coronavirus denialists now, there were in the Victorian period people denying how scientists thought that disease were being spread. There's no difference at all, tragically. So ventilation and light, each room to have at least one window, minimum window area, 1/10 floor area. half of this to be openable. I think it was last year, somebody was it Watford, a proposed conversion under permitted development of a factory into flats or accommodation, some of the rooms having no windows. Well, yes. Let's move on. Just some illustrations of what the guides to the model codes provided. So it's badly reproduced, but you can see different heights of wall, requirements of different thicknesses and different foundations. About fire, if buildings are close together, there's a requirement to build up parapets above the facade walls. Half timbering, not permitted. There's got to be a solid layer of brick behind the timber. Open space to the rear of buildings. And here there's a requirement that the taller the buildings get, the more the rear courtyard has to extend so that light and fresh air can get in. And in London, in the Building Acts, here's another illustration showing the general principle. Open space at the front as well. Here's the model bylaws, they're all in text, and it's difficult to write about things that are easily explained in a drawing. So that's why, one of the reasons why the guides to the model bylaws were introduced, and they were illustrated. So there's a requirement. Oh, well, look, I won't read that out, but in reading and understanding that, you would get the details of how far back you have to recess your house and leave an open space at the front from the buildings opposite. Far easier to put as a diagram, and particularly when you've got a funny shaped street, as is the case there. Stuff on drainage and sewerage, I'm sure you will recognize that sort of stuff, and the plans inside a house, and detailed cross sections here, baths and WCs, pretty impressive for the 1890s, I think, in this particular instant. It's well, I think most of us would recognise that now, apart from the low flush cistern and the bath with jacuzzi attachment. It's probably pretty much the same. So what was built? Well, this is in Jericho area of Oxford, under the Town Improvement Clauses Act, requiring minimum width of streets 30 foot, and this is what we've got, and a £645,000 house. And we've got a grid and another street in the same block, and you've got some nice big trees that are planted in a front garden where some buildings have been set back from behind the building line, and it's quite a good effect, I think. We'll move up to Bolton now. Now, houses built in 1910, roughly, between 1900 and 1910, according to the provisions of the model bylaws. So here they're asking for a 36-foot wide highway, with what would have been a 24-foot carriageway and 6-foot footways. It's not what we've got now. And back lanes were required, back streets, either 13-foot wide or 16-foot wide, and they're provided. So the privies in the backyard, the contents of the privies can be emptied and ash from coal fires be taken out and disposed of without having to take them through the front of the house. And there's that part of Bolton. As you can see, there is, I don't think, any green space at all, any green surfaces in that development whatsoever. I thought I'd throw this one in. Another, well, 40-foot street now. So this is in Oxford, and I don't know whether Oxford had a 40-foot bylaw subsequently, or sometimes 40-foot was a requirement for rural roads and lanes. Would a shark be permitted under the model bylaws? Yes, it would be, provided if it were non-combustible. The London Building Act 1894, and this is a classic street. So many streets in London are like this. 40-foot wide street, 24-foot carriageway, 8-foot footways, and trees planted, which have grown quite nicely. And the houses are now worth £1.1 million, which is 10 times the houses in Bolton. And the big difference is children in the street then and cars in the street now. The 24-foot carriageway is a long-standing specification that goes back centuries, and it's so you can have a vehicle parked on either side of the street, and there's room down the middle for a third vehicle to travel. Unfortunately, it's well, anyway, yeah, it's what's happened, isn't it? There's the grid, and problems and successes. Well, it succeeded. The bylaw system, it had a huge effect on preventing infectious disease. There was a steady increase in life expectancy as slums were cleared and these more generously proportioned houses were introduced, and broader streets. The problems experienced included a shortage of competent surveyors to ensure the compliance to the bylaws, and developers complained over increased construction costs. Country Life ran a campaign against the model bylaws in 1901, and I've said it's mostly preposterous because, well, the intention of the model bylaws was to help the most desperate people in society living in dreadful conditions. And Country Life, 1901, it's a magazine that's read by the richest people on the planet. So the sorts of criticisms. We found it impossible to construct cheap houses for the labourers on the farms and gardens because of regulations that were adopted to meet the requirements of the suburban part of the district. It was pushing up construction costs, gives useless trouble to local authorities, pushes up the rates, adds unreasonably to the cost of building, promotes the deadliest monotony, destroys all traditional building in design, stultifies invention. Local government board should be have its red tape scrapped. Well, people then offered different diagrams showing that you didn't need this width of street, it could be far narrower. Somebody wrote an illustrated letter. They put in the scheme below for a village in Norfolk, and they'd had it rejected. And I think basically they put in a shared space, and the bylaws don't allow a shared surface. It requires something with a curb and a footway. So they put in this plaintive letter saying that the scheme above would have been approved and the scheme below wouldn't. Also, it's got jetted construction, and the bylaws restricted the buildings of walls which protruded in front of others. Well, it's aesthetics over public health. It's worth debating this one, I think, and maybe it's unintended consequences too. Yes, they also argued that the increase in cost of construction that was caused by the exacting standards under the London Building Act and the model bylaws led to a reduction in the building of houses, and that led to overcrowding, and overcrowding led to an increase in disease, like diphtheria. And I think this is pretty much, it's a fairly cynical argument, and somewhat distasteful. So they go on complaining. The roof is to be covered with slate. This is rule number 52. It's to cover with slate, tile, metal, or other incombustible materials. And then the person often the criticism is the bylaws permit no freedom, either in design or the choice of materials. Well, you can have slate, tile, metal, or other incombustible materials. That's quite a big choice. And they illustrate the argument showing all of these wonderful rural properties that can't be built because of the bylaws. Yet if you think about when 1901, life in these buildings would not be straightforward. It's not like today when these buildings would have the luxury of central heating. Yes, and bylaw houses, bottom right. rural poverty was terrible. I don't think there's an appreciation of how awful the conditions were, how the dampness, the pervasive cold, the chill. So having bright, efficient, competently built housing has something to commend it. And I think we should maybe not judge the past by the standards of the present, or even by the standards of the wealthiest portion of the population in 1901. So that they were complaining about new streets, and you'll recognize some of this. So a new development takes place, a gang of men goes in that begin at once to deface and destroy this beautiful spot. They cut down the trees and remove the hedges and begin to lay out wide roads with curbs and footpaths till the old scene is no longer recognizable. Well, yes, that's a quick skirt over the country life argument. It's got relevance today, I think. So pushing up standards, pushing up, being more demanding about design, certainly can push up cost, and it can lead to landowners and developers losing income, revenue, profits. There is this issue of code compliance that if a builder wants to, if a developer wants to, they can just build the basic minimum that a code requires. And that was obviously done, but it didn't have to be done, and it wasn't always done. There's a problem of the code having to be written and deal with unforeseen circumstances and new technology. So in 1896, the car started arriving in Britain, but and that led to an entirely different chapter of streets and urban design. But that's another subject entirely. And then the operation and compliance issue. You need skilled professionals, both to do the design and to ensure the compliance, and you need political backing. Well, that's it, I think. So at this point, I'd like to hand over back to Katja and Adrianna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I mean, I found that really, really interesting, and in many ways actually quite shocking, because it's so similar to the debate we're having today. You know, many of the comments and arguments we are quite familiar with. But I think what's also interesting to note is that at the time, the codes were developed to improve the health and the life expectancy of people. So yes, there was an urban design, a kind of, I guess, aspect to it, but essentially it was for people. They were developed to create kind of better living environments. And I mean, I've also kind of seen some comments on the chat, and I wonder, because today we are talking about codes, not so much to improve the life of people, but partly to code beauty and attractiveness. And I mean, that's a whole different kind of question. And I mean, maybe that's why we are struggling so much as well, partly, because it's not just about the basics of light and sound and air quality. It's actually about aesthetics. But again, that's for later. That's for the discussion to follow. So now over to Adrianna Bonilla. She's an associate director at Boya, and she will give us an introduction and start off the discussion for tonight. Adrianna, over to you.
Thank you, Katja. I'll share my screen. Please let me know if you can see. Are you able to see the?
No, not yet.
Sorry. Okay, second try. Let's see.
Yes.
Is that okay now? Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Can you go on full screen?
Yes. It is. Perfect. Now.
Yeah.
Yes. Is that all right? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Katja. So first of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. As as Katja mentioned, this workshop is really about you, about listening to your views and comments about the design code and how they can hopefully shape the urban design group response to the consultation, which closes on the 27th of March. And just as setting the scene, I have divided the sort of presentation into 3 sections. I would first start by giving a quick overview of the background and the structure of the report, mainly to help those that haven't had the time to look at the report in detail or to be able to skim to it. And secondly, I would put some questions to you. These questions have emerged from previous informal discussions within the urban design community. Some of you have been involved in those conversations, and they are mainly intended to provide a structure so that we can hopefully assess the code in a more objective way. They are by no means extensive, so please, if you think there are relevant questions that we have missed, to raise them. And finally, we will be inviting your comments and your participation. So, because we're quite keen to hear your views and comments about the design code. And if we have some time, about what are the implementation challenges that we'll be facing. So if I start with the background, and as we know, the National Model Design Code and the NPPF revised text aim to implement policy changes to respond to the findings and recommendation of the Living with Beauty report. The code also builds on the government aspirations and proposals to modernize the planning system to deliver better quality homes faster. So what is it? The document provides detailed guidance on the production of design codes, guides, and policies to promote successful design. It also intended to be used as a toolkit for to guide local authorities on design considerations and planning decisions, and also includes, the document also includes some methods to engage and capture the views of the local community. So what is the planning status? The code is part of the government collection of planning practice guidelines. It's also meant to supplement and support emerging guidelines, new or emerging guidelines like the environmental bill or the soon updated manual for streets, etc. And as such, it's expected that the code will be used as material consideration in planning decisions, and no doubt will support paragraph 130 of the NPPF to be able to refuse applications on design grounds. So giving a stronger weight to the quality of places. So what does the code include? Well, the code is composed of 2 documents. The first document, which is the National Model Design Code that you see on the top right, explains the purpose, objectives, and process to follow when developing design codes and guides, and includes guidelines with regard to what they call area types and code-wide guidelines based on the 10 characteristics of the National Design Guide. The second document, which is the guidelines note for design codes, set out the possible content for codes, which is also guidelines, but a bit more detailed guidelines and more extensive guidelines. And it also includes towards the end some advice about community engagement. So if we just quickly go through the first document, it starts by stating the purpose of the code as a document that provides guidance on design codes, and mentioning that the local planning authorities, as stated in the NPPF, are required to provide clarity about local design expectations at an early stage. And it also mentions that the code is a tool also available to communities and developers to be able to provide, to be able to set, deliver, and to be able to define, set and deliver those standards. And then we come to the objectives, again, stressing the need or the requirement for local authorities to provide, to produce design codes and guides, and to use the model design code as a baseline standard when preparing design codes. It also briefly talks about the benefits of the codes, which, among other things, is to provide clarity for both communities on the type of design and the type of development that is likely to happen, and clarity for developers on the type of content and issues they are expected to comply with. And it mentions how design codes are helpful to be able to maintain consistency on large schemes over a long period of time, which normally is what takes to develop large settlements or town extensions. And then it moves on to the application, stressing the need for codes to be flexible and to be able to suit and accommodate the particular local circumstances. And how they, and here it's a bit cautious, and how local authorities may collaborate with the developers and landowners on design codes, or how developers and landowners may also choose to prepare their own codes, and how also neighborhood planning groups could also choose to develop their own design codes. By giving a hint that local planning authorities should beforehand develop an overarching design vision that then will need to be followed on the preparation of design codes by either neighborhood groups or developers. And then it continues with establishing a coding process, which is divided into three stages, which is analysis, vision, and code, and how consultation is part of each of those stages. And just going to the first stage, which is analysis, it splits the section into two, which is scoping, basically agreeing the area and the policies that need to be addressed, and stressing the need for setting up a consultation strategy from the inset of the project. It also presents a table, which is the one you see on the top right, with some potential elements or issues that may be included as part of a design code. And then it continues with the baseline analysis, which is basically presenting the technical data and assessment that need to be done previously, so that can then inform guidelines on the code and a master plan. And then moving on to the vision part of the process, it's split into three. The first one is the design vision, and in here it briefly touches on the importance of involving the community and in bringing them with you to develop that vision, and how the vision should reflect the objectives of the local plan. But then it immediately goes into identifying areas. How do you identify areas? And then goes into details of, as you see on the page to the right, as well as probably how to identify areas depending on a character assessment. And then we have the coding plan, which is effectively feeding or collating all the analysis that took that happened at the baseline level, and preparing what they call coding plan. In this area, they use a very large region, a city or a town, and provide examples of the type of different areas, it seems, based on densities and perhaps character. And then we come to the section of the production of the master plan, and in here it explains that for large sites a master plan may be needed, and it says that master plan could be developed, so it could be produced by developers or landowners on their own, in partnership with local authorities, or by the local authorities on their own. So again, it's quite flexible. It also mentions that as part of the master planning process, that there should be a separate community engagement to consult on the master plan, and gives an example, as you see on the bottom right, about the layers of information that tend to be part of a master plan. And then finally, the document concludes with the coding part, which is split into two areas, into two sections, which is guidelines for area types, with guidelines specific per area, and the code-wide guidelines, which is guidelines that relates to the whole area of the code, regardless of area type. And both sections present the guidelines based again on the 10 principles of the National Design Guide. So continues like that. So that brings us to the end of the first document. The second document, which is the notes for design code, sets the possible content, but as mentioned, providing a lot more detail, and again based on the 10 principles of the National Design Guide, which you can see in the structure there to the left, to the right, and mention that effective codes are simple, concise, and specific, and that they tend to rely on visual and numerical information rather than in wording or policy wording. And just to give you an example of how the second document is structured, it goes through each of them characteristics. It presents, it starts with a brief introduction, then it includes some sort of subheadings, and then it develops each subheading in a bit more detail to conclude with a checklist, as you can see. So, I mean, I didn't want to bore you with lots of pages, but there's a lot of detail and examples to be used. And the document concludes with a couple of threads on community engagement, setting up the importance to involve the local community right from the start and at every stage of the coding process, and presents examples of tools and techniques, engagement methods, and places the responsibility of the engagement process on whoever is developing the code. And that brings us to the end of the second document. And just to finish with my presentation and give the space to you, these are the sort of questions that we've put together, and I'm just going to read some of them. But please feel free to start bringing your comments. I will also post them on the chat or leave this slide if you want to, so we can go back to them. But basically the question concentrate on questioning whether the purpose is clear, whether the code we think is addressed to everyone that is involved in the production of design codes, whether the application and scoping proposed is clear, or whether there is a certain level of ambiguity between what a design guide and design code should be, and whether they give it's clear to us where one could be more pertinent than the other. Also, whether we think the process is robust enough, or whether there's something missing in that process proposed as part of the coding process, and whether we in fact need two documents. So I would leave it to you. We really look forward to hear your views and comments, and do let us know if there's anything else we should consider. And hopefully, if we have some time, we can also talk about the implementation challenges that that the guide will face. So thank you very much. Katja, do you want me to stop sharing? And
yes, I think that would be good. Then we can kind of see each other a bit better. Thank you, Adrianna, for that overview of what is no doubt a very complex document. And I think many of us still need some more time to actually digest it and really get into the detail of it. Just in terms of getting the discussion going, I have just been wondering, do you have a function where you can put your virtual hand up if you want to talk? I've just been looking on my screen and I can't see it, because obviously I can only see, well, a few of you on my screen. So waving at me is actually not going to help very much. I mean, you can shout at me, that would work. But other than that, oh yes, I can see your hands going up, brilliant. So if you put your hand up, you want to talk, then I will pick you up. And so, I mean, I think Adrianna has posed a number of questions, and I mean, I think also there have been a number of questions in the chat already. One was, I think we had that actually before the event, was from Mark Pearson about how the code relates to local distinctiveness, and are we actually, by trying to code typical areas, are we, I guess, going back to a standard approach rather than kind of reinforcing local distinctiveness? And I was wondering, is Mark on the call? Do you want to say a few words about this question? Oh,
I am here, but that wasn't my question, I don't
was
think.
it not? Sorry, that's gone wrong in the chat though. But you had a question. Was that?
I did. I mean, I think it's an admirable piece of work in many ways. I mean, it's hugely complex. I don't know how you managed to get all of this complexity over to the community in order to consult with them properly. But the question I had was, because I'm arm wrestling with them all the time, is it really hitting the target in terms of getting the major house builders to up their game? Because if you know, there's lovely things about dense inner urban and urban settings, and you know, it's a great sort of textbook in a way. But when you get down to the suburban, low density sort of formats, which most of the major developers want to actually build because it's most profitable, I think it's not that robust as a code. You know, I'd like to see it stronger and actually attacking the part of the market which is developing the worst development.
Yep, that is a very good point, because the majority of the new builds is being delivered by the volume house builder sector. Does anyone want to come back to that? Yes, Tim, do you want to respond to that?
Just unmute myself. Good evening, everyone. It seems to me that the volume house builders are able to do what they do because people either don't value quality or are not prepared to pay for it. The best places that we see, and the ones that are always flagged up in the examples of good practice, are always, you know, inhabited by people with above average wealth. And I can't really see that the coding is going to make much difference to that reality.
Okay, I think there's a question there. Does the coding actually, what, can we only afford high quality in richer areas? Or, I mean, often as designers, we say good quality doesn't have to cost more, but maybe people have different opinions there. Anyone wants to respond to that point? No, I mean, I think certainly that kind of, I mean, one of my fear was that with a design coding approach that we might exaggerate the kind of, I guess, house builder approach, because that's about replication of, you know, typical units and street width and patterns. And are we in danger actually undoing all the work we did over the 10 years with focus of character and distinctiveness? Simon, I can see your hand is going up. Do you want to come in? Oh, you're muted. Simon, I think you're on mute. Can't hear you. Sorry, I still can't hear you. Can anyone else see? Sorry. Yeah. Hello?
You hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
It's a dodgy earphone. Yeah, we reviewed a scheme in Northstowe today based on your code, which is, I think, one of the best I've come across. And it was interesting. Joanne, actually, who was also on the review today, is somewhere here, or was earlier. But it would seem that the code was led the design team into the right direction, And it enabled the planning authority to get a much better scheme as the conversations developed. And the net result of that was that we had a lot of very interesting and productive conversations based on the scheme, which if the code had not been there, we wouldn't have been able to engage with it. And I think it was an unusual design in that it was a very rectilinear, very traditional in a sense, but responding to modern conditions. And it was something that I think we see so many poor schemes, perhaps advised by codes that are either too detailed or too irrelevant. But yours, I think, hits the nail on the head very well. And from our point of view, it made our job as design reviewers a lot simpler because it had a solid background upon which we could relate our criticisms.
Thank you.
Anyway, so that's a commercial for Tibbalds over.
Very nice to hear. But I think what's actually good to hear as well is because, as far as I'm aware, that scheme is taken forward by a normal house builder, not by a fancy architect or fancy.
It's a house builder who doesn't normally do stuff around. I mean, it's not one of the biggest ones, but it is a house builder. But I think they're unfamiliar with this, and I think that was part of the problem at the beginning, that they didn't have a set way of doing it in a way, so they had to learn on the job. And the architect, I think, also probably wasn't one of the normal ones that we often see. So they didn't go in with a set idea of how to do it. But your code really pushed them in the right directions. So that was productive.
Yeah. So can a code, what seems to be, does the code set the baseline from which then to move up forward?
Yeah, I think it does.
In a way.
Well, I think in this case, it gave them, I mean, they challenged it. And I think the planning authority have accepted some of the challenges. And obviously it's not perfect and there's plenty of things that can be improved. But from our point of view, it gave us a kind of critique, a background for our critique, which made it a more productive conversation.
Okay.
I'll shut up now.
Thank you. I've got two other hands. I've got Jeff Bishop and Joanna Preston. So Jeff,
okay, can people hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, right, okay. I'm the one, Katja, who picked up the local distinctiveness bit as a local distinctiveness freak, so I'll talk about that. I submitted it, so the easiest thing is to read it out, frankly, to get it right. Okay, recently 2 communities in adjacent neighbourhoods in Bristol have produced their own detailed character assessments. In both cases, the groups identified 10 distinct character areas within those neighbourhoods. Bristol's got around 85 residential neighbourhoods, so that's perhaps 850 distinct character areas. It would be, by the way, 2,700 in Wiltshire. According to the code, perhaps 50% of those will be classified as inner suburb, 50% as outer suburb, each with a single code for every distinctly different character area. That really, to me, is very blunt generalization. It does seem to trample across the whole idea of local distinctiveness, which interestingly, local distinctiveness is not used anywhere in the code, and yet local distinctiveness is an absolutely central plank of sustainable development as defined in the outcomes of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So I get very worried that local distinctiveness, particularly as done through neighbourhood plans, design statements for years or whatever, is going to be lost in this generalization of a very small number of area types.
Thank you, Jeff. I was wondering there because, I mean, local distinctiveness is a big part in the NPPF, as far as I'm aware. And they also have, it's a very important aspect for local communities. And I think the MPPF says something about being popular. I think the word is used somewhere. So I do wonder how that's kind of actually, that circle is going to be squared between community engagement, local distinctiveness, and standard typologies.
Yeah, I think it gets more complex than that. I mean, there was this document that I'm sure a number of you have seen by 4 architectural practices called Distinctively Local, which is all about local distinctiveness, but there's not a single word, not one word in that to suggest that local distinctiveness has anything to do with the people that live in a local area. That is chilling. How on earth did that even happen?
Good point. And I see lots of fingers and hands coming up. So, sorry, next one was Joanne, and then it's Roger, and then it's Mark.
Hi. I just wanted to, slightly going back to build on Simon's point actually about Northstowe, because I was involved in the first phase, the first phase of the second part of Northstowe, and now we're doing the sort of second part, which was a bit that was reviewed today. And it's quite interesting contrasting the two, because the first phase was by an architect who is very used to this type of quite housing project, quite innovative design, and the second phase is more of a kind of standard house builder that you might kind of more commonly expect to see. And I think what it's really highlighted to me is that the code has been really important in both of those, but it's gone really hand in hand with having a really well-resourced built and natural environment team within the council. So, for example, the first phase, we were able to be quite flexible around the code, because we could kind of give that level of flexibility to the architect and kind of just trust them a little bit. And it was also using modern methods of construction, so it kind of needed that degree of flexibility in order to make the scheme work. But then in the next phase that we've kind of been reviewing today, the code's been really, really helpful in kind of saying, no, this sets a kind of minimum standard. But I think one of the things that has also come out of that is that actually the kind of stuff that you need to rely on is often the principal stuff. It's not necessarily like loads and loads of detail. So yeah, that's just kind of a few observations, I suppose, kind of different ways that one code has been used and can be quite helpful in different phases of a project.
Thank you, John. And you mentioned, or you raised the issue of resources, and the resources that we have to have in the local authorities to, not only write the codes, but also to control them. And I think that was also one of the points that Adrianna made, and I'm sure it will come up in the discussion as well. Roger, do you want to go next?
Come on, work. Thank you. I can't get the video to come on, never mind. You can hear me, which is all that matters. You don't need to see me. So I'm thinking of this from the perspective of, responding from the organisation I work for, Cycle UK. So I'm a transport bod rather than an urban designer. So forgive me if I say anything that really puts my foot in it. I'm kind of struggling with the dilemma of, on the one hand, obviously distinctiveness is a good thing, and it's a kind of almost like a mother and applehood pie statement, versus street design, where as a cycle campaigner, and indeed as a pedestrian campaigner, you want a certain amount of predictability and safety for the people walking and cycling. Now, the Dutch do this by having, as far as I can tell, a fairly standard approach to the visual impact of the street design. The surfaces for the motor vehicles are black, the surfaces for the pedestrians are sort of an off-white greyish sort of colour, and the cycling surfaces are red. And then in any kind of shared space streets, you use kind of red red sort of tiles, and that's a shared surface street. Doesn't, as to my mind, to diminish the distinctiveness of every other aspect of street design, the places where the children can play in the street and the planting and different layouts of the houses. Is this a dilemma, or actually is it perfectly reasonable to say, well, actually there can be some predictability to the layout of the street bit, the movement bit of the street, and still allow for distinctiveness in every other aspect of street design. And the other thing that, just while I've got the floor, is it does strike me that beauty is another kind of motherhood and apple pie. Everyone, of course, is in favour of beauty, aren't we all? But the idea that beauty is lack of beauty as a reason to reject developments is great, but shouldn't unsustainable locations and unsustainable designs also be a reason for refusing permission? It does strike me that the government has got very obsessed with beauty, which is of course a good thing that they're obsessed with beauty, but to the exclusion of other things like sustainability. You know, a beautifully designed development in an unsustainable location would still be an unsustainable development. We need to kind of give a bit more weight to other things as alongside beauty. I don't want to diminish beauty at all, obviously.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. And I think very, very important point you made there, and it goes back to the presentation of Robert Huxford as well, because I mean, I think not all standards are bad, and I mean, I hope people on the call kind of certainly agree. I mean, when we talk about health and kind of light and getting people around safely, but I guess the focus needs to lie on people, not refuse vehicles, for example, or something else. And I think it's maybe it's a fine line, isn't it, that we are trying to tread between standards that are appropriate and positive and not getting the kind of cookie cutter approach that everything is the same everywhere. And I think that's what this document is, you know, is trying to do, and that is a very, very hard thing to achieve. I think, Mark, you had your hands up earlier.
Well, only if I don't wish to hog the thing, but the thing which is missing for me in this main document is something about how you organize the information of a code well, and it's so important. Clearly, Katja, from Simon's comments, you've cracked it, and Tibbalds is a good practice, but it seems to me that so many codes are badly organized as in the way in which they're sort of framed. And the key thing, I think, is the regulating plan. It can actually solve so much. And there's not one mention, I don't think, in this document about, you know, how to put a code together, and the importance of that. And one particular instance is that it's very easy to fall into the trap that all the codes are about generalities. So you have a plot, you have a street, and then you woof, you know, it's 60 meters long or whatever. But the business of building groupings, you know, the possibility just that there is some romantic or picturesque qualities to townscape. You know, Gordon Cullen, I think, would be swiveling in his grave. You know, we need to have codes which are able to compose parts of places. And you do that, I think, through a really good regulating plan. And I wish something was in there which just highlighted that, because it gets us out of the trap of boredom, basically. You know, in the wrong hands, I think this guidance could end up with monotony. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's one of the challenges, I think, in this code, in this discussion, isn't it? And we can see it already tonight, that code is trying on one side to cover site-specific codes where a regulatory plan is really useful, or the kind of, as Jeff was saying, about the kind of whole area. And so that needs a different approach. And I mean, I think you're right, a bit more guidance is probably or maybe a bit more distinction between those two different scenarios, because I think coding a whole county is a very different thing from coding a site. I can see Jeff shaking his head when I say a whole county, but, you know, essentially that's partly, I think, what this code is aiming for, but I might misread it. Adrianna, do you have any thoughts? I mean, you've looked at the code in a lot of detail.
I mean, I totally agree. To me, there is a bit of an ambiguity there on they're trying to cover too many things. They're trying to which, you know, with all respect, is a very difficult task to do, but they're trying to cover guidelines for design guides, local design guides, and for design codes, which, you know, they both require, they both can look at different zones or can be good for different regions or type of sites, but also for the level of prescriptions that they should give, and to me is where probably the guide could, the code could be improved in perhaps making that clearer, because I think for town extensions or new settlements it's extremely important to give prescription. Otherwise, you know, it's just open to whatever. So you really need to give prescription. Obviously, the key is to balance prescription with flexibility and be able to prescribe something that will be effectively delivered, that will be practical and deliverable, but that will ensure a certain level of quality at least.
Is it a bit like that you have to decide what you actually talk about? I mean, talk about the kind of die in the ditch kind of elements, a bit like what Robert Huxford was talking. Those were the essential elements that needed to be coded because they saved life. I mean, we are talking about other aspects, but we can't code for everything.
But for instance, for big region, you know, for if you're looking at a wider area, then maybe a design guide is more pertinent and you can give guidelines. But if you're talking about a large site, you need, in my view, a certain level of prescription. If you only give guidelines, it can be interpreted in so many different ways. For instance, I could say, you know, parking should be designed as to not to have a negative impact on the street scene. So that can be interpreted in many different ways. Or alternative, I could say, well, if there is parking on the street or parking courts, they need to be broken up. Let's say you will have to put a tree for every 6 parking space, you know, but something that is a bit more tangible, because otherwise, if you just give guidelines that pretty much copy policy, to me, there's little use on that.
But so, do we need a kind of more better distinction between codes and guidance? And you mentioned design guidance for areas, and I mean, I've seen in the chat, and sorry if I'm pulling you up now, there's Matthew Hardy talked about the Essex design guide. So would that be, that's something that this new national model design code is actually promoting? Are we talking about more design guides, county-wide design guides? Matthew, do you want to say a few words? You don't have to if you don't want to. Maybe he's not even here. Tim, but your hand has gone up.
Yeah, I'm not responding to that last point, but I was struck by the first item on the chat from Richard Summers, which was referring to the points you were making in your opening remarks about the things which we don't really have control over when we're acting as urban designers or code users. It seems to me that a lot of the things that we find distasteful in new developments arise from the things which are outside the scope of the code. Parking was just mentioned, and I think that's a classic example. We've now got many local authorities who have minimum parking standards rather than maximum parking standards, and a lot of them are onerous, 2 and 3 car spaces per dwelling, for example. It becomes almost impossible to meet the aspiration of limiting the visual impact of parking when you're dealing with that quantity vehicles. But there's other examples too. I mean, a lot of the things which are contained in local plans, Roger Geffen mentioned the location of development, and obviously that's has a crucial impact on what you can do in terms of good design. But there's other things. There's the privatized utilities who dump their boxes of various shapes and sizes and colors all over the footway or whatever. You've got the adoption rules of the local highway department and so on. There's quite a number of things which really box you in when you're trying to achieve a quality design. So although within the document itself, I think it's an impressive set of principles and ideas. You know, it is a complex document, but I suppose my question or my worry would be that we can't, despite all of that, we can't actually overcome many of the things that box us in.
Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's one of my, I think, personal missions to align all these different documents. I would like to have all government documents from all the different ministries to align, that they kind of, you know, go in the same direction and allow us to actually do what we want to do, create good places. I was just wondering, I mean, also looking through the chat, and again, I might be just pulling something up. There's Ulrike Kern has mentioned an example from Berlin, from Germany, and I was just wondering, Ulrike, do you want to tell us a bit about it so we can learn also and see from other examples?
Sorry, I'm not sure how to unmute myself. Okay, I only came across this guidance in Berlin when I was doing some kind of street design project for Clapham, but actually as part of a course. But it was quite clear that this guidance was 100 years old from the original Gründerzeit, Victorian period, and it prescribes how wide a pavement is, the bands next to the building, the bands next to the street, how car parking can be incorporated, etc. And basically the design hasn't really changed in 100 years, except in some areas they use better materials, maybe natural flagstones rather than concrete pavers. But the basic system was worked out over 100 years ago, and it seems to work now, although I'm not sure whether it's used in sort of very suburban areas, but in the inner city areas, it seems to be used everywhere and actually looks quite good and is well done. And it's not very difficult for people to construct it because they know what the basic rules are. It's got about 5 to 10 materials, and that's basically it. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think I think something that probably maybe we're all struggling with, and also I think the recent white paper potentially, that I think in many ways, I think there's a drive towards a more, well, I don't want to call it a European system, but a more kind of stricter system where you have kind of clear regulations, a bit more black and white, and a bit away from the negotiations that is kind of like in the kind of, I guess, in the English way of doing things, which kind of has a lot of real advantages because you create amazing places that can be different from one another. And there's negotiation as well. So I think there's a bit of a struggle about wanting to kind of simplify things and having simple rules. But I don't think that always actually works with our planning system and the way of things are done in this country. So I think there are some lessons about trying to adapt approaches from elsewhere, and trying to imply them on the kind of, well, the nation, really. But I've got another hand up. Is it Haytham? Sorry, is that how you pronounce your name?
Hi, it's Hatem.
Hatem.
Yeah, sorry. Well, my question is, because of, I mean, I think the national design model design code is really complex, and it's I just wonder, just to make my question simple, how easy would it be to consult, have a public consultation or a local consultation on this guide? And are there, because I understand that there are different methods of consultation, and each method would come out with a different, for example, feedback on it. Has anyone discussed the different methods of consultation? Because it's quite a complex code for us as professionals. How about just to consult with the public on this?
Yes, you've raised a very difficult, a very great challenge in terms of how do we consult on codes, which are often very technical or expected to be technical, and also reading the National Model Design Code together with the white paper puts a lot of emphasis on the codes as almost the final stage of consultation in the process. Does anyone want to come back to that? I'm looking at Jeff, although you can't see me looking at you, but I know you probably have something to say to that.
Yeah, I forget for a moment that, as someone has already raised, the practicalities of engaging all of those communities around all this sort of thing and getting agreement. And the first thing I would say is I have worries about who wrote the code, because they mix up interchangeably consultation, involvement, and engagement, when any proper practitioner of community engagement knows that they are very different and need to be kept separate. And as you know, Katja, and a couple of other people on this know, I actually spend an awful lot of my time actually working with communities on character assessment, on design guidance, etc., not so much on codes. There are a whole series of very simple methods of getting across to people, very interesting, enjoyable, engaging methods where they don't even know they're discussing design or guidance or codes or whatever. But there's a whole raft of material in there that needs working on. There's a whole series of ways of doing it. And how on earth you're going to do that with communities, back to my Bristol example, 85 of them across the whole of Bristol, in a room, somehow in a workshop, agreeing what it might be, and then agreeing that my neighbourhood is going to have the same code as another 25 or 30 of all that lot. That challenge at the broader level of managing the whole process, for me at this moment, is totally insuperable. Doing it on a day-to-day basis around a site, and I think there's been a very key point made, Adrianna made it, or not Pearson made it, that there is a key difference between how you approach an area as to how you approach a site. Coding for me has great value done properly at site level. It runs out of its value at area level. Site level, no problem of engaging with communities if you understand the difference between consultation, involvement, and engagement.
Thank you, Jeff.
Is it possible? Unfortunately, I can't get a hand symbol, so I can't raise my hand to ask. But I just wanted to pick up from that because one of the things I'm very keen on is if I'm reading the code guidance correctly, if you want to produce and legitimize in planning your own code, then you must have training and get an engagement of the community. Otherwise, it won't be accepted as a legitimate, you can't use it as a material consideration. And I think that's really quite, and that, as I put in one of my earlier comments, that is a huge resourcing implication for local authorities. And as you've said already, this distinction between, say in my case, a citywide code versus then the area codes, which are clearly going to be the responsibility of local authorities. If they're going to prepare them, they're not going to be prepared by developers. The developers are going to be very interested in preparing the site codes and the things that they're interested in. But this question, and it's admirable to want this, I think we all appreciate, we like this level of engagement with community, but it's my understanding is that unless you use the local plan, so you're producing a local plan and you put your design code into the local plan and it's then seen as gone through that mechanism, if you're going to create a code which is your version to be enforced over the national, you've got to have this process of, it talks about training the local community so they understand design issues, and it talks about engaging the local community in producing the code. And I think I can see just lots of local authorities automatically just going to the National Model Design Code as the default code. because they'll look at the level of commitment in order to legitimize and actually get a proper planning material consideration out of this for a design code and think, well, there's no way we can do this in resourcing terms.
Isn't there also, before you, or at the start of the engagement, you need a vision, don't you? You need to know what you're going to code. I mean, you can't just code something not knowing what you actually want to achieve. So where's that vision coming from? If we are talking area-wide. I mean, I don't know if the document says anything about that particularly, or how we do that. It seems to focus on the last stages of the process in many ways.
I think the assumption is that local authorities' local plans will have set the new style local plans will have set the design vision. So in many ways, you can see an authority like mine, which is in the process of doing the local plan or starting the local plan and is determining whether it's worthwhile doing with the new planning white paper and therefore having to produce another one within 3 years if you produce one now. I can see, that is a sort of real difficulty sort of moving forward for local authorities with these particular, the emphasis on moving the design codes, which I think was made in one of the chats in terms of the consistency and how long they could be around and enforceable.
I think that's, I mean, I guess the vision, and I mean, in my experience, and local plans as well, I think it's often really hard to engage the communities at that stage in the vision, because then you're almost kind of like, you're stuck between kind of two elements. One is the vision, which sometimes feels too fluffy, I guess, for people to engage in. And then the code is almost potentially too detailed and too technical. So, I don't know how we do that. But I mean, is there something in terms of our response? I mean, it sounds a bit like that we need a bit more clarity about the engagement process that needs to sit alongside the code, and a bit more clarity of what is expected. Yeah. I mean, we also know that, and maybe somebody else knows the numbers better. I think in the white paper, a new local plan was expected to take 3 months. Was it 3 months? It was a very short time. So I don't know how this new model design code fits into that new system. Okay, anyone, any other comments, anything we haven't talked about? Adrianna, I think we haven't really kind of gone to a lot of your questions about the clarity, but I think, the discussion probably shows that we need more clarity on some elements. Is there anything, Adrianna, you want to pick up? Any questions?
No, I think in a sort of a way we have answered some of the questions, and I think as you mentioned, one of the main one is clarity on few things like engagement and definition of design code, design guide, and the areas they could cover. So, but just to summarize, I think in any case, I believe we all agree that the code is no doubt a step forward in trying to improve the quality of design, and it's a welcome document, despite the limitations it may have.
Yes, I mean, I think the ambition for delivering greater quality, and the ambition to involve people earlier and better. I think a lot of really good ambitions are in there, and as always, I guess the devil is in the detail of how we actually implement and put this into practice. I mean, the government has, I think the deadline was on Monday, wasn't it, for the pilots to submit their proposals. So hopefully we'll see kind of the pilots, and they will be testing the code and the different processes of it. And I hope many of you probably hopefully have put in applications for that funding. And so that in a few months' time, we will see what actually comes out of it, and the code actually being properly tested. I have a feeling there are no hands coming up anymore, and also the chat is kind of quieting down. I think we probably had a long discussion. I mean, more than 1.5 hours on, oh no, Robert Huxford.
Yeah, can I ask one question? And do we know where, and Katja, you're not allowed to say, where Katja showed us a slide of a church and some half-timbered buildings, because we're all local distinctiveness experts, where was that location? And I got it wrong, and I'll explain why I got it wrong shortly. Does anybody know where it is? Or do I have to give you a good telling off? Anybody going to volunteer? Can you share it again? Says somebody.
Yes.
Says Roger. So I think that it'll inform our discussion about local distinctiveness quite a lot if we just have a brief chat about this.
God, now I'm starting to wonder if I got it wrong.
Oh yeah, you've got it right. I checked.
Oh, good. Let me just.
I mean, that's a trouble, and you can take lots of photographs, and for the life of me, I can never remember. That's it. Brilliant. Okay, so where is that? Can we?
It looks like Exeter. No, not Exeter. No.
Not Exeter. No.
No.
Why is it at Exeter?
Because at the back of the cathedral, there is a little street, but no, you cannot see the cathedral. Sorry, no, it's not. But you know,
okay,
whatever is left is similar, but you don't see the cathedral tower.
You're going from the basis of the shape of the street, so that's a first thing to recognise. It's not Norwich, and that's an interesting guess. Why might it have been Norwich? York? No, it's not York. Looks like Essex. Yes, I think that would be that's what I thought. I think it's in Kent. That's not right. Well, look, analysing this, on the right-hand side, you've got close studding. So I think we're in the 16th century, and we're not in Herefordshire. That was a terrible guess, whoever said that. They use box framing in Herefordshire. Honestly, what a disgrace. Right, but if you look at the church tower, so the close studying puts it in the southeast. The church tower, we're now looking at the colours, and when it was zoomed up, you could see little flint panels. So thank you very much. There's a flint panel in the corner abutments. That's not a Herefordshire spike, is it? No, it's not a Herefordshire spike. It's the wrong colour stone for Herefordshire, isn't it? Hertfordshire. Sorry, I can't read. I need new reading glasses. You've got that checkerboard effect. So we're looking at the colour. We're in the southeast. We now got to identify the stone, and flint. We're on flint. So we're in somewhere near chalk, and yet the church isn't. It's in Hastings. There is no flint for about 20 or 30 miles. You have to get up to Dover or down to Eastbourne. So that church is an example of not local distinctiveness, and it's using Gothic arches, which are ubiquitous. I mean, they all over the country. Gothic arches, early Perpendicular. Kent wasn't very far off. Yeah, all right. It's just interesting that is that church an example of local distinctiveness? it is may not be locally distinctive, but it is beautiful. It's worth just not probing what we mean by local distinctiveness a little bit more in a more detailed way. And we recognise shapes, we recognise architectural styles, but also and materials and colours. I think it's fascinating. And also it's why the materials there and why the designs are used is to me the important question. Right, that's quite enough for me. Sorry about that, Katja. And nobody got a prize, nobody at all. The prize was going to be an ice cream on Hastings Pier, which unfortunately is closed, and they didn't sell ice creams there anyway, so it was a bit of a non-event.
Thank you,
There's
Robert.
a nice fish and chips.
Nice fish and chips. You're dead right.
Thank you. I think to be honest, I mean, that discussion was really, really nice end to the discussion, and also made a really good point that I think distinctiveness is, often it is about materials, but it's about the kink in the road and the view that is kind of unique, and the kind of topography and all those elements that come together. But yeah, we have a lot to learn about distinctiveness. I think places that are memorable, that for me is the importance, that where have you been, you kind of describe it to someone and they can find it and it sticks in your mind as something nice and beautiful. To end up with the kind of, the word we are trying to code, beautiful, what is it? But I think that's another discussion, that's another evening to kind of figure out what beautiful is. So I think for tonight, thank you very much. Thank you everybody who contributed. We are writing down and we are collecting everything that is in the chat. We have another event on the National Model Design Code on the 10th of March, where we have a series of speakers from all sorts of different fields, looking from the landscape perspective, the planning perspective, the highway perspective, I think we have an economist, the finance kind of side of things. So I think one where we are kind of really kind of trying to branch out and get a lot of different views. That event will see 5 or 6 speakers and then a little bit time for discussion again afterwards. So next,
one point, it's Mr. Reynolds' event next week, and maybe if he's in reach of the keyboard, he could tell us about it. There he is.
I'll just do a very quick introduction. It's going to be about the future of working. There's a lot of discussion at the moment. In fact, I was involved in another discussion just today about the future of the office, but we're going to look at it a bit more broadly than that, and the kind of post-pandemic world, future of working, and what the impact on the city is likely to be, and towns in particular. We've got a few people who have contacted me after I put a post up on LinkedIn who are going to give kind of 5-minute sound bites on where they think we're going from their professional perspectives. If anyone else would like to do the same, drop me a comment here or send me a message on LinkedIn, and we'll hear from half a dozen people, and then it's going to be a kind of open discussion debate. So anyone who fancies getting involved, sign up, and we'll see you here at the same time next week, I think.
Great. Thank you, Paul. So yeah, watch the space. See you here again in a week's time, and well, I'll hope you keep well, and continue to coping with the continued lockdown and the daily walks around the local park. So nice to see you all. Thanks for your contributions. Bye bye.